Hi, good morning everyone on the West Coast and good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast joining us. Thank you for signing on for the October AllAmerica City Promising Practices webinar featuring the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work with the Kellogg Foundation. We're very glad to have everyone join us on the phone and through the online meeting. And I'm Sarah Lipscomb. I'm the Program Director of the AllAmerica City Award here at the National Civic League. And the National Civic League is a 123-year-old nonprofit that advances civic engagement to create equitable, thriving communities. And the AllAmerica City Award is our flagship program that began in 1949 to recognize exceptional civic engagement in local governments and communities. And this work culminates in an annual event every year where we choose 10 winners. And we have begun this AllAmerica City Promising Practices webinar series about a year ago as a way to continue the learning in between our annual events and to really get our network connected with more information and more innovative practices and learning from around the country. So before we get started and I hand it over to our speaker, Mike, I just want to briefly touch on the 2018 AllAmerica City Awards to give you all some background information. For 2018, we are focusing on promoting equity through inclusive civic engagement. And this spotlight was specifically chosen in regards to our Kellogg work. And also 2018 is the 50th anniversary of the report on the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, more commonly known as the Kerner Commission. So we are using 2018 as a look back at that report and to see how far we've come and quite frankly how far we haven't come. So we use the AllAmerica City application as a way to promote our equity work and our civic engagement work throughout the year. And as you can see here, there's the criteria for the award. So we're really focused on civic engagement, equity, collaboration, innovation, and impact. And a new piece of our application in regards to the racial healing work is a new staple of application, how equitable are opportunities in your community. And this webinar, specifically Mike's topics on truth, racial healing, and transformation will really help provide some background on that piece of the application in which we ask communities to take an inventory or an equity audit of their leadership, of their economic opportunities, of their infrastructure updates, as a way for us to really start moving the needle and measuring how we're doing on equity in our communities. So this will be a great webinar to give people some background information and some tools on how to approach that in your community. And October 18th is our first deadline of a letter of intent if anyone is interested in applying, although it's not required. And then February 28th is the application deadline, so there is plenty of time for those of you who are just now hearing about the AllAmerica City Award to consider doing it for 2018 in your community. So again, I just wanted to very briefly go over the award, but you can download the application online, and I'm always here to answer any questions and to help communities think through their specific application process. Before we get started to Mike, just a few housekeeping things. Everyone is on mute right now, and we will have plenty of time for question and answers at the end. And we do ask that you submit your questions through the message icon on your online meeting. And if you could please just send it to Sarah or the host. I will field the questions for everyone towards the end. And finally, there will be a follow-up email after the webinar that will include a recording so you all can share it and play it for some of your colleagues who maybe didn't have a chance to join us. Mike has also graciously offered his email address so you all can connect with him afterwards to answer any more further in-depth questions. We'll also be sending out the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Implementation Guide that went out in the pre-materials as well. And then finally, more information on the AllAmerica City Award and a very brief survey. I promise it's brief. It's only 3 questions that we would love to have you all fill out after this webinar as well. Okay, so with all those housekeeping things taken out of the way, I want to introduce our speaker, Mike Wegner, who is an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the George Washington University and a senior consultant on race relations with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and a senior fellow at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Mike?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining. First, let me thank Sarah for arranging this and Doug Linkhart, the head of the National Civic League, for being so supportive. I was an AllAmerica City judge about 20 years ago, so I'm quite familiar with the National Civic League and with the AllAmerica Cities Awards, and so it's a pleasure for me to be doing this for today with the National Civic League. Let me start by acknowledging a couple of people at the Kellogg Foundation who are the driving forces behind Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. Of course, the president and CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, LeJune Montgomery Tabron, the visionary person who actually envisioned this, created it, and made it real is Dr. Gail Christopher, who took her retirement option from the Kellogg Foundation just a couple of months ago. But Gail Christopher is the visionary who is responsible for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. It's my view that we're at the beginning of something that is truly exciting and that over time can actually transform our society from one in which we believe this myth of a hierarchy of racial value, hierarchy of human value based on superficial racial characteristics, superficial physical characteristics such as skin color and facial features. And I think over time we can transform our society into one in which we recognize and embrace and cherish our common humanity and learn to see ourselves in one another. And it begins with organizations like the National Civic League and the hundreds, perhaps thousands of AllAmerica cities from the past. Let me give you a brief overview of what I'll try to cover today. Here are the points I'll try to cover as briefly as possible so as to leave time for questions. What is the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort? And as we so often do, we try to combine it into a series of letters, so we're calling it the TRHT. I want to talk just briefly about racism in America and change in America, and then the evolution of the TRHT, the more than 100 voluntary partner organizations that are part of the TRHT, the framework we've used to design the process, the visioning process, the summit, the 10 initial location grants that the Kellogg Foundation has given out, the 10 college campuses that are creating TRHT campus centers, and then a little bit about the sectors and examples of possible TRHT activities. So let me start with what is the TRHT. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation led TRHT. It builds on the history, insights, and collective brand of the over 40 truth and racial reconciliation efforts around the world. There actually are 44 that I'm aware of around the world, the best known being South Africa, obviously, but many others, including in Australia, more recently in Canada, and a number of other places around the world. We're designing a unique approach for this country, focused, as I said earlier, specifically on the underlying false yet overarching belief in a hierarchy of human value based on superficial physical characteristics such as skin color and facial features. In the past, we've tried to overcome the legacy of our history by focusing on the manifestations of this legacy and ignoring the root cause of these manifestations, the root cause being the racial hierarchy. So we've achieved a lot of progress over time. I was involved deeply in the civil rights movement. I was in college during the early 60s, spent time organizing in the North, in New York City at Queens College, where I went to school, and also in the South, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where they had closed the schools rather than desegregate them from 1959 to 1964. So we've dealt with manifestations in the past, but we've never really dealt with the underlying cause of these manifestations, the racial hierarchy. So despite the progress we've made, there remains significant racial divisions and disparities in virtually every institution of our society. If we had figured out how to deal with the racial hierarchy, we might not be enduring at this point, for example, efforts at voter suppression rather than making it easier to vote. We might not be enduring the trend toward the resegregation of public schools or the mass incarceration of young Black and Latino men. And let me say also that the examples of truth and racial reconciliation efforts around the world also are not limited to outside the United States. We recently had one in Maine with the Wabanaki Indians, so that's an example of a truth, racial healing, and transformation effort in this country. I should also say that we are intentionally using the term racial healing rather than reconciliation. Reconciliation implies that we were once close in the past and now we're reconciling. We've never had a society in which racial equity was the reality. So there is not anything to reconcile. There are wounds to heal, and that is essentially what we're trying to do. So our goal is to unearth and jettison the deeply embedded belief in a hierarchy of human value by creating a vision of a racism-free society, acknowledging the truth of our history and its legacy, particularly the conscious and unconscious biases that pervade all of our institutions, and then engaging all sectors in transforming our society into one in which we cherish our common humanity and can see ourselves in one another. And we are engaging communities and institutions across the country in activities that promote both racial healing and racial equity. I should also say that we have done at least 2 studies to create a foundation for what is going on. We did a study of the 44 truth racial reconciliation efforts around the world, and we've also done some case studies in the United States with Kellogg grantees, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So let me just mention briefly racism in America. I teach an entire semester about racism in America. Actually, I teach 2 semesters about that. So trying to do this in 3 minutes is a little tough. But let me just share with you what our belief is. The belief in a hierarchy of human value has persisted throughout our history, as evidenced by the twin evils of slavery and conquest. that have led to, among many other horrific experiences, the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, Jim Crow racism, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and government-incentivized residential segregation, particularly during the period after World War II in the 20th century. We see these manifestations today in the negative racial stereotypes, which still persist, in conscious and unconscious bias and a sense of white privilege that fuel the immigration debates and rear their ugly heads in the death of unarmed African Americans and others at the hands of the police, in the recent events in Charlottesville, and in many everyday events across the country. Let me just cite one piece of evidence about our unconscious biases. Some of you are aware, I'm sure, of the Harvard Implicit Association test, which one can take online. There are a bunch of them, but the one I'm talking about is the one on race. Millions of people have taken this test online, and the only people who take it essentially are people who care about the issue, so it's a self-selected group to begin with. Of that self-selected group, the results of the test indicate that 80% of white people who take this test and 50% of African Americans who take this test show a bias in favor of whiteness. Basically, people who take the test are people who care about racism and are largely anti-racist. So even among those of us working in the field, we still exhibit unconscious bias in a variety of ways, and there are countless studies, which I'd be happy to share with you if you're interested, that validate this point. I tell my students that anybody who tells you they don't have a racist zone in their body is either lying or they're delusional, because I think in this culture it's very difficult to avoid having some level of unconscious bias. On the other hand, the reason for optimism and the reason that we think change can come is that many white Americans are becoming more aware of the pain and injustices that people of color continue to endure. This is on the next slide. In a recent poll, 53% of white Americans said more changes need to be made to achieve equal rights. That's up from 39% a year ago. Among Hispanic Americans, 70% say more change is needed, up from 54%. And among African Americans, 86% agree. So it's our belief that now is the time when people are recognizing the divisions that exist and the pain that exists and are seeking change. And some of the events, if there's any silver lining in any of the events that have occurred, from Charlottesville to taking a knee in the National Football League and a number of other things, if there's any silver lining in this, it is that we are becoming more aware of the divisions that exist and the pain that exists, and more anxious to seek change. Let me tell you a bit about how the TRHT has evolved. About 8 or 9 years ago, the Kellogg Foundation launched its America Healing Initiative. The idea there was to engage communities in engaging in activities to promote racial equity across the country, and also to do research on racial equity. And so much of the work, much of the research you may be seeing now on unconscious bias has actually been supported by the Kellogg Foundation. America Healing, over time, Kellogg spent about $200 million on grants to well over 100 communities across the country. And as America Healing evolved over about 5 to 6 years, Dr. Christopher, who was also responsible for the vision for America Healing, had this vision to create a truth racial healing and transformation effort. Started with a meeting of about 50 to 75 Kellogg grantees in December of 2015. Then Gail and colleagues spent 3 to 4 months reaching out to potential partner organizations across the country to engage them. Then there was about a 6-month design team process, and I'll talk about all of this in a minute. Then there was a TRHT summit in Carlsbad, California in December of 2016. Subsequently, Kellogg has provided 10 initial location grants, as well as a grant to the Association of American Colleges and Universities that is working to set up 10 initial TRHT campus centers around the country, and they also have a significant amount of funding from the Newman's Own Foundation. And then I'll talk briefly about the sector strategy. So first, some of the 100-plus TRHT partner organizations. There are, of course, the ones that you would expect. The NAACP, the National Urban League, National Congress of American Indians, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, National Congress of American Indians, National Conference of La Raza. But there are also a number, National Civic League, a number of others that you might not expect to be engaged. So in addition to the National Civic League, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University, the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation at the University of Mississippi, the American Library Association, Boys and Girls Clubs of America, YWCA, National League of Cities, American Public Health Association, Sundance Institute, and many others. And I'll give you a website towards the end where you can find a listing of all of them. The TRHT framework was one designed largely by Dr. Christopher with the participation of several of her colleagues. It starts with narrative change. So if we are going to change the myth, change the belief in a racial hierarchy in this country, we're going to have to change the narrative of this country. And so one of the design groups, there are 5 design teams who engaged in the planning for TRHT. So one of the groups was narrative change, and they are working with the entertainment industry, journalism and media, and all of these other institutions, school groups, cultural institutions, etc., to change the narrative in this country. And I should say, by the way, that these 5 design teams are populated by representatives from the more than 100 partner organizations. So each of these design teams, which actually worked for about 6 months from about June to the end of November into early December to the summit in Carlsbad, had somewhere between 20 and 30 members, and each of the 100-plus partner organizations had a representative on at least one of these design teams. So there was narrative change. Then there's racial healing and relationship building. And relationship building really involves meaningful, deep relationships. And I'll talk a bit about healing circles at the end, which is one of the tools we're using to promote racial healing. And then there were 3 substantive policy-oriented design teams: separation, which included segregation, colonization, and concentrated poverty, and you see the issues there that this group addressed. Then law, including civil, criminal, and public policy, and you see there the issues that they addressed. And then the economy, structured inequality and barriers to opportunity, and you can see the issues that they address. We had 5 questions which framed the work for each of the design teams. Those 5 questions were, first, what will America look like when we have jettisoned a belief in a hierarchy of human value? Most of us start with what is the problem, and that takes us to dealing with the manifestation, but not with the underlying root cause. Gail's vision was that we needed to have a vision first of where we were going, and then deal with how to get there. So the first question, which all the design teams addressed, is what will America look like in the legal system? What will America look like in the economic system? What will America look like when we are not so separated, when we have jettisoned a belief in a hierarchy of human value? Second question was, where are we now and how did we get here? And that's about our history and the legacy of that history. So, for example, the separation team and the legal team as well dealt with how federal government incentivized residential segregation during the housing boom after World War II, and many other legacies of our history. Then what are the key leverage points for transforming this area, the economic structure, the legal structure, separation, the narrative for the country, for transforming this area to jettison a belief in a hierarchy of human value? Then who needs to be involved in order to make the deep and lasting changes that we need to make? And then some of the key activities that need to happen in order to heal from and transform this area. The 5 design teams each produced reports which are contained in this document, design team recommendations. The reports of all 5 design teams are in this document, and that can be provided to you, but it's a powerful, in-depth document which addresses our vision for the future, our history and the legacy of that history, but potential change points, stakeholders, and who else needs to be involved, and specific recommendations for the future. Then there's the implementation guide to which Sarah referred in her opening remarks. And this guide outlines a set of principles for the TRHT, and it specifically addresses ways in which communities, organizations, and individuals can work to change the narrative in this country and implement some of the recommendations. So where are we today? You can find a lot of information at the website there, healourcommunities.org. It's a website created by the Kellogg Foundation, and it contains key information about the TRHT. It also contains a link to the implementation guide, which can be downloaded online. The other important website is the website of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and you see that website there. That website will take you to the 2016 fall issue of their quarterly magazine entitled Liberal Education. They devoted that entire issue to the TRHT, particularly to the planning effort. I would encourage you strongly to go to that website, download the magazine, and review it. It will really give you great information about the planning process for the TRHT and where we hope to be headed. Kellogg has also, as mentioned, provided 10 TRHT PLACE grants in 14 cities at an investment over the next 3 years of about $24 million. And the next slide will show you the map of where these communities are located. So there are two essential statewide grants, Alaska and 4 communities in Michigan. Then there are St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Buffalo, Richmond, Virginia, Selma, Alabama, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans, Dallas, and Los Angeles. And they are focusing under a number of core principles that Kellogg has put together for them. So they have to be working on a design that can be sustained and owned by communities. Kellogg is not directing what they do other than these core principles. So the community gets to choose their lead organization. In most cases, they've been community foundations. How much their investment is, they have to match the Kellogg investment, and how much seed money they require to grow the endowment. They have to create an endowment so that when Kellogg money runs out, they can continue their activities. They have to bring other funders to the table. They have to have representatives from every sector of society in that community. They have to agree to an evaluation process from the beginning. They have to agree to be part of a learning community with other TRHT places. And they have to work with in the 2 TRHT main pillars, narrative change and racial healing and relationship building. And then they can select one or more of the substantive areas, policy areas, separation, the law, and economic system to work on in their community based on the situation in their community. Then we have the 10 TRHT campus centers. Kellogg has provided a grant of about $400,000 to the Association of American Colleges and Universities to start TRHT campus centers. Newman's Own Foundation has put in $500,000 into this effort. The Association of American Colleges and Universities convened a panel of evaluators to look at the proposals. They got 125 proposals within a month of issuing an RFP, and so they selected these 10 with attention to ensuring diversity in race and ethnicity in the student body, geography, size, and approaches. And so you see the 10 there: Austin, Texas Community College, Brown, Duke, Hamlin in Minnesota, Millsaps in Mississippi, Rutgers, their Newark campus, Spelman College for Women in Georgia, which is a historically black college, the Citadel, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And as I said, they reflect a partnership between the Kellogg Foundation and Newman's Own Foundation. They have had already their kickoff meeting at the end of September. They will have a 5-day planning institute in January in which they'll have an opportunity to develop their specific plans and engage with the other campus centers to share ideas and develop their strategies. Then there is a sector strategy which is still in formation. The academic sector is pretty much what AAC&U is doing with the 10 campus centers, but there are also partner organizations that work in the health sector, meeting to talk about how to engage the health sectors. For example, the American Public Health Association and their affiliates across the country. Then there's a youth component: Boys and Girls Clubs of America, YWCA, YMCA, 4-H Leadership Council, a number of other organizations working on developing a plan for the youth sector. Faith and culture sector, entertainment, sports and media, the law sector, government sector, nonprofit sector, education sector, and others as well, working on developing strategies for each of those sectors. And I would say that if we can achieve that, these partner organizations have a reach of more than 200 million people across the country. So if we can engage them and their local affiliates, we can actually blanket the country with these activities and go a long way towards the transformation that we seek. Examples of possible activities that communities and campuses are engaging in with regard to truth, research on contemporary issues of race and how they've evolved, on community campus racial history, including how the belief in a racial hierarchy is embedded in our institutions. You may be aware of the work done by Brown University and more recently Georgetown University, William and Mary and others to unearth their history of racial hierarchy and how the transatlantic slave trade actually supported the growth of many of these institutions. Recommendations for addressing the legacy of our history. Then with regard to racial healing, joint community projects, campus-wide projects, memorialization, tangible and symbolic community campus activities. One quick example at the University of Mississippi, which James Meredith sought to desegregate in 1962, and 2 people were killed in the violence that ensued. They now have a memorial to James Meredith and a statue on that campus. Creation of opportunities for meaningful interracial relationships in communities and on campuses, and healing circles, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then in the transformation area, based on what we ascertained from the truth and the racial healing, enactment of changes in policies and practices, curriculum development, activities to increase meaningful diversity in the community and on campus, and engagement of the media and public and private partners throughout the country. One interesting example is that in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville recently, Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia has convened a commission on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he's got a broad membership of about 35 people from every sector that actually will work over the next several months to promote, to unearth the truth, promote racial healing, and actually recommend specific policy changes that can help prevent what happened in Charlottesville from happening again. Healing circles, just briefly. This too was developed by Gail Christopher. It is not a conversation. It is an experience in understanding our common humanity and learning to see ourselves in one another. We use stories as a powerful tool for promoting racial healing and racial equity. So we convene groups of 20 to 25 people. We provide them with a prompt for enabling them to tell a story, generally a positive story of time when they needed to be seen, heard, or understood and the impact that that had on them, or something that they are proud of within their culture or racial background and how that has affected their lives. We have probably 10 or 15 different prompts that we use to get people engaged in discussion in pairs and then in the group as a whole. It is an inclusive, expansive, and ongoing process. We, during the America Healing effort, there were 5 National America Healing Conferences that Kellogg supported, and it did a full day of racial healing at the beginning of every one of those conferences, and it had a huge impact on people. We've now done these healing circles at national conferences of independent sector, Unity, which is the organization of journalists of color, American Library Association, the MBA organizations for Black and Hispanic MBAs, Association of American Colleges and Universities. And in every case, people have left wanting more. So that is one tool we are using to promote racial healing, and I'd be happy to talk more about that if anybody wishes. Let me conclude by saying that I don't want to sugarcoat this process or the journey on which we've embarked. It can be difficult, even a bit scary, as dealing with issues of race usually is. But I want to leave you with a quote that might be helpful. About 10 years ago, I attended a speech by Dr. Vincent Harding, a professor of theology and a leader in the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, and he concluded his remarks with this quote: "If you don't ever walk through trouble or confront a risk or reach beyond your comfort zone, you will never meet the rest of yourself." So think about that. There's an entire part of ourselves, the part that shows the courage and strength to take risks, to overcome challenges, that we may never know unless we're willing to reach beyond our comfort zones. This is the courage and the strength I think it will take to overcome the racial hierarchy and to transform our society. So to paraphrase Robert Frost, we welcome you on the road less traveled. It will make all the difference. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for that really in-depth overview on Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation and how the process came about and some activities that people can have to get started. I also wanted to let everyone know my colleague Carla Kimbrough, who is our Racial Equity Program Director and who is part of the law design team, is also on the line with us now. So again, if you all have questions, please send them in the chat to the host. And I just wanted to start with the first question. A lot of communities that we work with, we hear this a lot, that they have seen racial divides in their communities and are just now recognizing how that is affecting residents' relationships with each other and with local institutions. So they know it's there, but then they have no idea where to start or what's next. So what would you say to those communities who haven't started this work yet?
My general feeling is that where one has to start is with unearthing the truth about the racial divisions that exist. How did they come about? Why did they come about? And what is their legacy today? If we don't understand our history, it's real hard to deal with current divisions and disparities. I'll give you one example of what I mean. There's a wonderful book entitled On the Courthouse Lawn by Sherilyn Ifill, who used to teach law at the University of Maryland, now is the head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. That name may be familiar because the late Gwen Ifill from Washington Week in Review and PBS NewsHour was her cousin. This book, On the Courthouse Lawn, chronicles the history of a community on the eastern shore of Maryland where there were 2 lynchings on the courthouse lawn in the early 1930s. In that community, there have been racial divisions since then. Black community in that town knows the history because it's been passed down from generation to generation. But the white community knew nothing about that history because it was all hushed up. And so, whereas the black community knew where the tensions arose from, the white community had no idea. And it wasn't until the white community learned a little bit about the history of their community, what happened 70 or 80 years ago, that they were able to begin a dialogue to address some of the concerns that existed in the community. And the reality is that many white people in that community wanted to heal but had no idea of what they were dealing with. And so that process depends on unearthing the background of the community. Now, that can be done. One of the thoughts that some communities have had is that local colleges, through their history departments, can begin to unearth the community's history. That's one option. But once there's a common understanding of the background of the racial background of the community, it becomes a lot easier to have dialogue, and it becomes a lot easier to have a meaningful racial interaction, and meaningful change can occur. I would point you to one other resource, an organization called Everyday Democracy, which used to be known as Study Circles, has a a dialogue guide on racism. I'd encourage you to go to the website of Everyday Democracy and download that guide. That will help significantly. And also look at the implementation guide that Kellogg has developed. But I do think that step number one is to unearth the history and to begin to develop a vision of what the community wants to look like, be like, feel like, if we can overcome the racial hierarchy.
Great, thank you. And I was taking notes on some of those resources that you mentioned, and we'll be sure to include those in the follow-up email. Along the same lines of that question, the previous question, do you have any examples or specific suggestions for mayors or city managers in particular on how they can help advance this work?
Yeah, interestingly, the National League of Cities is a partner organization, and they have done work on racial issues in the past, and they also have some literature and documents. I can't remember exactly what they called their initiative, but I would go to the website of the National League of Cities and look for guidance from them. The other thing that I would suggest is that it would help for a mayor or a city council to convene something like a local commission, such as Governor McAuliffe has done for the state of Virginia. Engage every sector of the community on this commission, or whatever might be appropriate to call it, and begin to talk with them about what you would like the community to look like if we can overcome the racial hierarchy, and then begin to talk about some of the issues, some of the barriers, and begin to move in that direction. Also, as the 10 communities, the 10 grants that have gone to 14 communities, Kellogg Foundation, as they begin to develop ideas and activities, they will post them on the website, so there will be some guidance there. I think if you can start there, that will lead you to a variety of other options. I also think that many of the AllAmerica cities of the past have engaged in racial equity activities, and I'm guessing that there are promising practices to be developed or to be adapted from the work that many of the AllAmerica cities have done.
Perfect, thank you. And that was a great segue. There are many examples of previous AllAmerica City winners who have started this work, and I would be happy to share some of those in the follow-up as well. A few examples that come to mind: Marshall, Texas, who was a 2015 AllAmerica City. They have what's called the Burrard History Trail, and they have Wiley College there, which is was home to James Farmer and the movie The Great Debaters that some people might know about, and a lot of really prominent civil rights activists. So they created a walking trail to commemorate that history and to unearth some of the great leaders that they had from the civil rights movement and some of the legacy of racism that was still existing in the community. So I'm happy to share more information on that. Also in Tallahassee, Florida, they have a park called Cascades Park that was put on top of a previous neighborhood, a black neighborhood that was taken by the city through eminent domain. And they used that as an opportunity to really dig into that history and the wounds that that caused and the economic implications that that caused for the black community in Tallahassee, and were able to create a memorial to that neighborhood, and it was a great way to start healing conversations in the city of Tallahassee. I also want to hand it over to Carla Kimbrough, the program racial equity director here, just to mention some of the things that she's been working on and some examples that she's heard through the Kellogg work.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to mention that in coming weeks, the National Civic League will post a number of executive orders and model ordinances that cities can download and use to create policies that would help promote racial equity and equity in general. And we will also include among those executive orders the item which Mike referred to from the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, regarding the Governor's Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So in coming weeks, you'll see a number of resources that cities can use to help improve their policies.
Yeah, I also see in the message box a message about the City of Seattle, which has created a curriculum to train people to do train dialogues on race facilitators, and a program to guide cities, and also Wichita, Kansas, which has the Red Bud Trail that also acknowledges African American history, and also Richmond, Virginia, has a slave trail, and they walk people along the slave trail with some narrative, and I've done that, and it is incredibly powerful and really raises a number of issues that need to be addressed. And I see another post about the city of Portland, which has passed an ordinance regarding racial equity goals and strategies. So there are a number of examples around the country of things that can be done. And when Carla sends out all of this information, I think it'll give you more than enough material to begin doing what you think is appropriate in your community.
Great. And do you have any other examples, whether it's the truth, the healing, or the transformation activities that you spoke about earlier, and some of those that have been happening around the country?
The grants from Kellogg were awarded at the end of June or early July, so most of the communities are now just getting started. But over the next several months, there will be a number of activities, and I think on the Healing Our Community website, they'll be posting examples of activities going on in communities around the country. So I would simply suggest that people note that website and check it every so often to see examples of what's happening in those communities, and also consult the implementation guidebook, which you're going to share. And I also see a message here about a book list on titles related to racism. I have a list of about 25 or 26 that I give to my graduate students, and I'll be happy to send that list to Sarah for her to distribute.
Great. Yes, that would be very helpful. And just to echo what you said, the Healing Our Communities website has lots of different examples. Kellogg does a really great job of pulling all of the resources of all their grantees and communities who are doing this work. And soon, if it's not already up there, they will be sharing the National Civic League's All-America Conversations meeting toolkit. So that's also something that we can happily share in the follow-up materials. And it's basically a meeting in a box. It helps communities walk through how to talk about the divides in their communities and how to start working on those. And it is a full toolkit. It even has sample sign-in sheets and invitations and an activity to think through who are all the stakeholders in your community and how to reach out and get people who need to be involved, and people who haven't had the opportunity to be involved in local institutions work before. Carla, did you want to give the example about that you had learned about libraries and how that's another avenue for communities to be thinking about equity?
Right, and this probably goes along with the truth aspect of the TRHT movement, and that is simply that libraries can not only perform an audit of what types of books they are using or they catalog, but how they offer story times and what type of presenters they might bring to the library to share with the community. For example, in Cedar Rapids, they have a program where sort of a TED-like talk where they bring people of different backgrounds into the library to give presentations so that people can begin to get to know each other in ways that they might not have considered otherwise.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we still have a few more questions rolling in. Just a little bit more about the racial hierarchy. And, you know, Mike, I really appreciate how Kellogg always starts with a positive visioning question. What are some things that you have heard before that are some tangible takeaways of what it would look like if we did eliminate the belief in a racial human hierarchy?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. And each of the design teams came up with their own vision of what the law sector would look like, what the economy would look like, what our communities would look like. I can only speak from my own personal beliefs. I encourage people to go look at the design team recommendations. But from my perspective, we would have a society in which we, to be brief about it, succinct, we'd have a society in which skin color, facial features, none of those superficial physical characteristics would have any bearing whatsoever on one's ability to achieve one's desires during their lives. Those factors would have no significance over our control of our destiny. So we would be able to see ourselves in one another. We'd be able to embrace our common humanity. We would have fewer incidents of police of African Americans and Latinos dying in police custody, because police would see people as human beings rather than as threats. It is not to diminish the reality of the threatening behavior that police often see and have to deal with, but it would, they would not, skin color would not be a factor in how they react. In school, we would have a curriculum in which we teach about the contributions of every population group, not just white folks. We teach about African-American inventors like Garrett Morgan, diplomats like Ralph Bunche, historians like John Hope Franklin. We teach about great African-American writers like Zora Neale Hurston, like Richard Wright, like Ralph Ellison, like James Baldwin. It'd be those sorts of things. I could go on in some detail, but that gives you a sense of what occurs to me when we talk about a vision for a society free of the racial hierarchy. And somebody asked a question about the rankings of races from top to bottom within the racial hierarchy. The way Kellogg is looking at it is that the dominant group in society has always been a white group, Caucasians, and what we're looking at is trying to eliminate, without getting into racial hierarchies or the oppression Olympics or anything like that, what we would like to see ultimately is a society in which there is no hierarchy at all, and in which we do not demonize people in any way based on skin color, based on religious beliefs, based on sexual orientation, any of those things. Oh, and one other thing that occurs to me is, I mentioned religion. We would not see every event in which someone of Arab descent or Muslim religion is viewed as a terrorist. We would see a society in which we look at every person as an individual and not demonize entire groups in any way, shape, or form.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer questions. And I know that there were a few that we didn't get to, but we are a little past the top of the hour, so we are going to wrap up this webinar. But as I said before, I will include Mike's email address, my own, and Carla's as well. So any questions you all are welcome to send to us. And in the very brief survey that we very much want you to fill out will be an opportunity for you to put your email address in to learn more and get access to more resources as we announce them here at the National Civic League, and to keep you abreast of everything that Kellogg is doing as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you again, Mike, for volunteering to give your time, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Monday.
And thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed it, and I wish you the best of luck going forward.
Great. Thank you.